Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are in the first chapter of Principles of Macroeconomics, and we, in the last video, looked at our definition of economics, kind of what it is, what it's studying, thinking about scarcity, and how we make decisions in the face of scarcity. We talked a little bit about the difference between micro and macroeconomics, and ended with fiscal and monetary policy. So check that out if you haven't already. And we're going to finish this first chapter in a very similar vein by looking at this overview of economic systems. Okay, in the last video, we talked a little bit about this idea of if you were to make everything on your own. And I shared a link to another YouTube video about making your own sandwich completely from scratch. And it took the guy who tried to do this $1,500 in 6 months to do it. So all sorts of things were necessary to make that sandwich. Everyone in today's society doesn't do that by themselves, but instead it's through a very complex set of interactions between all sorts of people, farmers, millers, bakers, people who raise chickens, people who raise produce, let alone everybody who makes the tools that all of these other people need to use. And so what we're going to be thinking about in this lecture is how do we organize this very complicated and complex systems of interactions for an economy to function. So nobody in particular is doing this. If we're thinking about now, if we look at these bullet points, the number of televisions that are in any given city at any given point in time. How is it decided how many televisions are going to be on the shelves at the stores? How many people are going to be employed manufacturing those TVs? And then how are they going to be made? What are the parts going to be there? Is the supply chain going to be able to supply all the parts? If you start to really peel back the layers, you start to realize how complicated complex a process this really is. And so the question in the end here is, how does everything get done? And there's not one answer to that question. There are multiple numbers of ways that it could get done. And we're going to talk about 3 ways that historically economies have been structured in order to make things happen. We'll go back in history, although to an extent there are some places around the world where this still happens. But we're going to start with traditional economies. We'll talk about command economies. And finally, market economies, along with some examples. Economies. Okay, traditional economies, command economies, and market economies. We'll start with traditional, but not spend a whole lot of time on it. Here, we're thinking about the oldest economic system in the world. It is still used in some parts of the world today. But instead of assigning occupations by skill or interest or talent, markets in traditional economies are organized more by other types of systems. For example, family tradition. So if you think about some last names, like Smith, for example. Way back in history, people with the last name of Smith, their families were blacksmiths, right? Same with Miller, same with Baker, and so on and so forth. Their names were attached with their profession, and if your dad was a baker, you were going to be a baker as well. So just organizing by family tradition and doing what your parents did, that was one way that many economic systems were organized. Another is by caste, which is even still present in some parts of India and a few other countries today, where you're born into a socioeconomic status within society, and that's basically it. So it's not quite as widespread today as it used to be historically, but it still exists. And if you're born into a lower class in society, you may never have a chance to be, for example, a lawyer or a priest, right? There's a special caste just for the priests. And so whether or not you would be good at something or whether or not you want to do something, in these traditional economies, you simply can't. And so basically, all of these benefits we talked about in the last video, where with the specialization of labor and trade, benefiting because people can do what they want, they can do what they're good at, they can produce things better, more quickly, and with higher quality. All of those things go out the system, all of those things go out the window in an economic system like this. So typically and historically, economies under these types of economic systems have had significantly lower growth than, well, particularly what we'll be talking about at the end, market economies. But before we move on to market economies, let's talk about command economies, where all the decision making is centralized, right? And if we go back to this idea of how do we make all the TVs? Who works in the TV manufacturing plants? How are the supply chains organized? Which city is the manufacturing city? And how do we know how many TVs need to be in each store kind of around the whole country? So in a command economy with a centralized decision-making process, all of this system is organized and passed down through a single ruler or potentially a small ruling party. So that's our definition here. In command economies, economic effort is devoted to goals. Let's start with that. Economic effort is devoted to goals passed down from a ruler or ruling class. Passed down from a ruler or ruling class. Okay, and a couple examples there. Ancient Egypt, medieval kingdoms. A lot of times we have in the past communist or dictatorial economies. For example, the Soviet Union, the USSR, North Korea, even today, would be examples of command economies, where everything is centrally planned. The leader or the ruling class decide this many TVs need to be in each town. These people will be the employees to make TVs. They will decide if they even have prices in that economy. They will decide on the prices and so on and so forth. So that's command economies. I will just point out this link here through economics library. It has a lot of really nuanced differences between these types of economies. So on the more command economy side of things, you have things like communism, socialism, Marxism. On the more free market side of things, we have capitalism, free markets, libertarianism. This website has detailed kind of descriptions of each of these things and kind of the nuanced differences between them. Okay, so moving on the supply and demand of goods in a command economy, both of these, so actually I'll just write them both together, are determined, supply is determined and demand is estimated by the central government. So the government needs to decide how much are we going to supply to the country. That part can be challenging, but the particularly hard part to do is to estimate the demand. So how do we know how many people want TVs or how many people want bread each week? And so this is particularly hard to do and often is the reason why many of these economies fail or have a lot of serious economic problems, shortages, is because it's really hard to estimate what people want, to know every single person's individual preferences. So that's the command economy. And the last one we'll talk about is the market economy. So unlike the command economy, which is centralized, market economy is a decentralized institution, bringing together buyers and sellers, individuals and businesses, and all of this comes together through the price system. Through the price system. So it's through prices. No single entity, no person, no ruling class. There's no oversight into deciding, okay, this town needs so many TVs. When there's a town and everybody really likes TVs there, if you go to the store and all the TVs are sold out, the business will see, oh, there's some disequilibrium in the market. All the TVs sold out. We should increase the prices a little bit. That an increase in the prices will incentivize TV manufacturers to make more TVs and to send them to those towns. No individual person is going to be deciding that sort of thing. So it's through the prices, and we're going to see this in a lot of detail, particularly in the next chapter once we start talking about this complex system of prices coming about through the supply and demand of goods in a market. Okay, so here, each exchange is undertaken as a voluntary agreement between two people or groups of people. And a couple examples of market economies. The USA is quite moderately high in its market. Most of Western Europe, and even places, and I'll put one in particular, so Singapore, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but Singapore is a very economically free, very market economy based example of an Asian country, among many others. So just a few examples there, and like we talked about in the command economy, the supply and demand for goods in a market economy is an emergent order. So dependent upon each other and driven by this idea of the invisible hand of the market, right? And ultimately, again, that comes down to prices. So again, a couple links I highly recommend. If you just YouTube this iPencil, it's a little kind of monologue by Milton Friedman, a huge advocate for market economies. And then this Read, Watch, Listen, It's a Wonderful Loaf by Russ Roberts, another big contemporary advocate of the idea of markets of emergent order and kind of how that brings a lot of benefit to society, and it works as a great way to organize an economy. So you can check those out. It's a Wonderful Loaf. That's by Russ Roberts, one of my favorite economists. And also, this iPencil is by Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics. And this iPencil is again talking about how a pencil is made, and it has some wood in it, it has some graphite, it has the paint, it has the rubber, it has a little brass thing to hold the rubber eraser. And all of these people from all around the world, who maybe don't even know each other, who don't speak the same language, they come together through the market. And with this idea of specialization in trade, come together to produce such a small little device, which is the pencil, and simple device. But ultimately, it's through a huge number of market interactions from all around the world to make it possible. So highly recommend that video. And the same thing with the Wonderful Loaf is basically the same thing about all the things that come together in order to make sure we have bread on our shelves at the stores. So check those out. They're really great. And then let's just round off this lecture with coming a little bit back to reality. And we talked about command economies, we talked about market economies, but in reality, these are not totally distinct from each other. A lot of economies have some mix of regulatory oversight and being very free market oriented. So on this next link that I have down there, the Heritage Foundation, there's this Economic Freedom Index. And the Heritage Foundation comes up with this index by ranking countries on their rule of law, like how great are their legal institutions, what's the corruption level in the economy, how easy is it to start businesses, how open are they to free trade, and some other things like this. So I highly recommend checking that out. And you can see where all the countries rank. And so there are going to be 5 categories here, and I'm just going to put a few in each to give you an idea about how, in reality, these are really mixed, and some economies are more economically free and some are less. So let's start down toward the low end. Some examples of very low economic freedom rankings. We have North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba, for example. Moderately low, China and Russia. In the middle, a couple examples, Mexico and France. Moderate to high, we have the United States and Germany. And among the highest, actually the number one highest is Singapore, which recently overtook Hong Kong. Hong Kong was for quite some time the highest ranked in economic freedom. A lot of kind of unrest happening in Hong Kong at the moment, and more oversight from mainland China. So Singapore has recently taken the top spot. Another top one up there is Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland are among some of the other highest economic freedom countries. Okay, so just a list, but I really highly recommend. There's also a great data download where you can download all of the data. It has all sorts of macroeconomic variables for each of these countries. So I highly recommend checking that out. All right, and so that is that is the overview here for this first chapter for our class on macroeconomics. We've seen that we benefit from specialization in trade, and this idea of trade being particularly relevant with the idea of market economies. And through that, we can solve this problem of scarcity. We end up having better prices, more variety, and more to go around for all the countries involved and all the people involved in this process and these interactions of trading with each other. So it is a complex process. It is a complex set of interactions between all the buyers and sellers. And through these buyers and sellers, we're going to formalize this idea of the market through this idea of supply and demand. So typically the buyers make up the demand, and the sellers make up the supply for goods and services around the economy. We're going to formalize this into a model to help explain how the economy works. So supply and demand, again, kind of a mix between micro and macro. We're going to form the foundations of it, which are really more microeconomics in their foundation, but then apply the idea of supply and demand to macroeconomic ideas and policies like unemployment and minimum wages and immigration affecting wages and the labor market, for example. Okay, so all of this stuff is to come. Stay tuned for that in the next video. Thanks.